It's 6:30 and we are ready to start this evening's lecture. Let me welcome you all to virtual UEA. My name is Alan Finlayson. I'm the Professor of Social and Political Theory at the university, and I'm hosting and chairing for this evening. So this is the first in a lecture series titled After Brexit, Utopia or Dystopia? And the congratulations for organising that series don't go to me, they go to my esteemed colleague, Professor Hussein Kassim, who's organised this as part of wider research projects that he's involved with, including one called Negotiating the Future, which has been studying the Article 50 negotiations and is continuing to look at the developing relationship between the UK and the EU, and is part of a nationwide research programme called the UK in a Changing Europe, which is providing information, debate and discussion about lots of aspects of the politics of the UK's relationship with Europe, but also post-Brexit politics more broadly. I do recommend the website of the UK and a Changing Europe if you want to find out more. So what's the idea of this series? Well, I'm going to speak for myself, not for Hussein, but it seems to me that some at the moment would like to say Brexit's done, it's all over with, we don't need to talk about it again. Others want to say, oh no, let's reopen it, let's do it all over again. It seems to me that neither is quite right. There are lots of unresolved issues still about the relationship of the UK with the EU, things to be formally reviewed and assessed. But the politics of Brexit are much wider, I think, even than that. I think there's much deeper uncertainty and contestation about the future of British politics, the British economy, the British state. And I think that a lot of the roots of our rather complex political cultural divisions right now lie in different ideas about and different feelings towards and fears about the future. We don't really have a common view of how we're going to live in the future. We don't have common fears about what the future is going to be like. And that, of course, brings us then to this question of utopia and dystopia. What are the hopes? What are the fears that are shaping our political thinking and behaviour right now? There's so much in play about the future of the Union, the future of the UK's role in the world, the future of our economy. Well, in the midst of all that certainty about the future, what can a politics department do? Well, I think one thing we can do, apart from studying it, like my colleague Hussein is try and provide times and places for people with all kinds of ideas about that future to pause a little bit, to listen to each other, to ask questions and think for a bit. That's what a university is best at, and we are good at it, despite what you might have read. We are places for free debate and discussion about the political issues that divide as well as unite us. And we're going to have 5 weeks of that discussion and debate around this question of Brexit, utopia and dystopia. Now, who do you invite to kick off such a series? Well, I think there's only one person you could possibly invite, and we have invited Daniel Hannan. So I'm sure you all know who Daniel Hannan is. He was a member of European Parliament from 1999 to 2019, a long-serving and very prominent member of the European Parliament, a key figure, I think. It's no exaggeration to say, in the politics of Britain and the EU for a long time. Founder of Vote Leave, just one instance of his important effect on British politics. He is now the Vice Chairman and International Ambassador of the Conservative Party. He's a member of the UK Board of Trade, which is, I learned a moment ago, in its quadricentennial year, 400 years of existence. And he's now in the House of Lords as Baron Hannan of Kingsclere. And if you don't know, Kingsclere is a very nice village in Hampshire, nestled sort of between Aldermaston and Greenham Common and quite near to Watership Down. So sites of rather different and contested past visions of future utopias and dystopias. He's also a very prolific writer, for which I'm very grateful. I've basically made my career reading what politicians write and then explaining it to people. That's gotten harder over the years as they write less and they write less well, but not Daniel Hannan. He's visiting lecturer at the University of Buckingham. He's written 14 books and he writes several regular columns. So he's definitely, in my view, one of the more thoughtful, intellectually engaged and challenging of politicians. So his talk tonight is entitled, After the Lockdowns, Did COVID-19 Kill Global Britain? He's going to talk for about 30 minutes or so and is looking forward to taking a range of questions and addressing a range of topics in discussion afterwards. Please do use not the chat, but the Q&A function. We can't see you, but we do want to hear from you in that Q&A function so we can ask the questions after Daniel has spoken. But with that, that's enough from me. You came here not to hear me. You came here to hear Daniel Hannan. And so I hand over to Daniel. Thank you very much for coming and look forward to hearing what you're going to say.
Good, thank you. Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I tell you what, of all the things you said there, Alan, the thing that impressed me most is knowing where Kingsclere is, a tiny little village nestled, as you correctly say, at the foot of Watership Down. the inspiration for the eponymous novel of Richard Adams's, which is really, I suppose, a novel about the Second World War in which the Second World War doesn't appear. I've often thought there should be a name for novels about the First World War in which the First World War doesn't appear. So, you know, Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, or Lord of the Rings, or Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies, novels where the trenches are a brooding, monstrous offstage presence, but you infer them from the impact they had on people. You never actually see them. Watership Down is a novel about how everything was changed when unmarshalled people were suddenly forced into a difficult situation. And it's in that spirit that I want to talk about the crisis we're going through now, because, you know, when I accepted this invitation, I was expecting to be able to come and do it in the flesh, and I thought that we'd be back to normal and we'd be back to our traditional tedious culture wars about Brexit and you know, what's on the side of a bus and all this. But frankly, something has happened that is so much bigger since then that it would be perverse not to address it. Things are not going to get back to normal. The world into which we emerge after these lockdowns is going to be poorer, meaner, more pinched, more authoritarian. As we haul ourselves from the pupa, the chrysalis of lockdown, we will be subtly transformed, and not in a good way. There will be an appetite for illiberalism, a demand for the smack of firm government that would have been hard to imagine 2 years ago. And it's in that sense, since you teed me up with Watership Down, that I think a parallel can be made with what happened after 1945. Now, I'm not a great one for dragging the Second World War into contemporary references. It's overdone. You know, I sometimes think that we evidently teach nothing in our schools except the Nazi period in the Second World War, because that seems to be the only historical reference point that people have. References to the Second World War should be made, what is it the prayer book says about marriage? Reverently, discreetly, advisedly, soberly. But I think that it is legitimate to make a narrow and specific linkage in this sense. After 1945, we found that powers that the state had seized on a supposedly contingent basis were not returned. Authorities extended, notionally because of the emergency, the need to defeat Hitler, were then retained for years, sometimes for decades, after the victory had been won. We had identity cards until 1952. We had food rationing until 1954. We had full male conscription until 1960. And when it comes to the economic controls that were put into place during the mobilization, in many cases, they lasted until the Thatcher reforms in the 1980s. Indeed, in some aspects of our public services, they're still with us today. Why did that happen? Because the psychological changes induced by the war and the mobilization led to a greater demand for state control. And I think we are going to see exactly, in fact, we are already seeing worldwide exactly the same phenomenon in response to the coronavirus. Try arguing now that we've run out of money. When did you last hear any politician argue for the removal of any grant or any, the screwing shut of any spending tap? Money to charities, money to businesses, extra money in the benefit system or public sector pay or whatever. When did you hear anyone prepared to go on the airwaves and say, where's the money coming from? Parliament has become like a kind of permanent episode of the Today programme, a series of spending demands, each individually justifiable, but collectively unaffordable. And in that sense, it's just like what happened in the early Attlee government. Nobody then was prepared to listen to the argument that we'd run out of money, that we'd emptied our treasury and exhausted our credit in defeating the Nazis, and that we needed to retrench. On the contrary, people felt then as now that they'd earned themselves a pay rise, that the experience through which they had just passed entitled them to a number of additional benefits from the state. And so at the moment when we could least afford it, we embarked on a massive expansion of state power and state spending. And I can see exactly the same thing happening now. And I'll tell you why I think it is. It's because there are some aspects of the experience of the last 14 months that people find satisfying. I saw a program on the Channel 4 News a few weeks ago, and it was about an enterprising printer in South London who had been sending out postcards and inviting people to write their most intimate lockdown secrets to be then returned as part of a display. And the theme, according to this printer, that ran through them all was, "I'm going to miss the lockdown." Now, I reckon most of us have heard that sentiment, perhaps whispered furtively. It's, on the one level, an astonishing idea that we are asking for any prolongation of what we've just been through, this extraordinary, unique, unprecedented loss of liberties, worse even than we've been through in wartime. And yet, there are people who have enjoyed, if you like, the feeling of solidarity, of community, of purpose. A book came out some years ago in the United States, the early years of this century, called Tribe, by a psychologist called Sebastian Jung. And it's about the way in which a modern society leaves people hankering after the kind of kin group and tribe for which we've been shaped by a million years of evolution. He begins, for example, with an extraordinary, to me, extraordinary discussion about the way in which people in North America were constantly running away from English-speaking societies to join indigenous societies, but never the other way around. He opens with a quote, I think, from Ben Franklin saying, if you take an Indian boy, you send him to a mission school, the first opportunity, he runs back and rejoins his people. But if it's the other way around, if it's a kidnapped white child and you rescue them, you put them back with their nearest surviving kin, they will, of course, at the first opportunity, run off and join the natives. Now, why? When there was, by the 19th century, quite a big disparity in standards of living, why did this keep happening? Because, argues Jung, there is something a little bit artificial, something that makes us uneasy. We are, for example, the first generation in the planet where most people have had their own rooms, have been accustomed to sleeping in their own rooms. And this, he says, leaves us hankering for something. And when there is a war or a natural disaster or any other perception of a common threat, we find that that need is filled. He interviews, for example, a lot of survivors of the siege of Sarajevo. And this is a theme in all of their conversations. They say, look, for heaven's sake, don't say that we missed the war. You know, we don't want the snipers shooting at us again. But we all knew what we had to do. There was this great sense that there were no strangers, that every neighbor was family. We were all pulling together. The boys would go off and fight at the front. The girls would get everything ready while they were gone. And we all had our place. Now, obviously, it's a much less dramatic thing than being shot at by snipers in Sarajevo. But when I look around my village and I listen to people celebrating the things that they've done together, the way that they've been running grocery deliveries to each other and setting up food banks and checking in on their elderly neighbors and doing all of these things, you can see why people sometimes sound nostalgic for the Blitz. And then, as now, when you translate those intuitions, those emotions into politics, you find that they translate into a demand for a much more authoritarian and interventionist state. So, to put it another way, an experience of this kind throws us back onto our most elemental heuristics, our basic caveman intuitions. Hunker down, keep an eye on your children, stay safe, avoid strangers, they probably carry pathogens, right? When you translate those things into policy, in a modern Western country, they become close the schools, close the shops, close the borders. There's much more appetite for strong government. There's much more appetite for public spending. There's much more appetite for doing things together. There's much more appetite, frankly, for straight protectionism, right? I've lost count of how many people over the past 12 months have said to me, previously pro-market people have said to me things like, Surely, Hannon, even you can now see why we need to grow more of our own food in this country. Surely even you have had your eyes opened by this pandemic to the need for greater food security. Really? I mean, that's what you got from the last year? I get that people's inner caveman feels that, right? As I say, we were not designed for this world of superabundance and skyscrapers, right? We're still, in our genes, we're still on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. We have a deep-rooted instinct that tells us to hoard food so that we can see our way through the winter. But if you look rationally at what happened over the course of the lockdowns, frankly, the one thing it should have taught us is the value of imports. We are currently, as we were when the lockdown first came in 2020, we are currently in the period known by British farmers and retailers as the hungry gap. Right? It's called the hungry gap because basically it's the season when we don't produce any food in this country. Had we not been able to import whatever we needed from wherever we needed, we'd have been living on rhubarb and asparagus, right? That's what you have in April. Maybe a little bit of nettle soup and some purple sprouting broccoli, right? We've reached the end of the winter harvest. We've run out of the potatoes and the turnips. We haven't yet reached the first summer harvest. But fortunately, both this time last year and now, global markets have continued to function. We've been able to source what we need from around the world, which leads me to an important but counterintuitive point. You do not have food security by growing food yourself. Growing food yourself makes you just as vulnerable to a localized shock, a particular disruption or bad weather or interruption, as depending on a single source abroad. Right? The way to have absolute food security is to purchase from as wide a variety of suppliers as possible, so that there's always going to be a surplus somewhere, right? And if you like, we stress tested that to the limit. When there was a global simultaneous closure with the coronavirus, the system worked, right? Logically, look at all these rows about who's getting the vaccines and where are we going to get them from. The one thing we should be learning is how important it is to be able to buy things. And yet, of course, in hoc to our Stone Age instincts and intuitions, we fret about self-sufficiency. Consider this. There's one country in the world which has elevated self-sufficiency in food and in everything else to the supreme principle of government. And that's North Korea. They call it juche. Everything should be made at home if at all possible. North Korea is now the last place on the planet where there are still famines outside wartime. At the other end of that scale, country least like North Korea in terms of its agri-foods policy, Singapore. Singapore does not produce one edible ounce, right? Singapore is absolutely reliant on imports for everything, for water, for electricity, and yet it has the cheapest and most secure food in the world. Why? Because the way to have security is to have diversity of supply. Now, here's the thing. That was a difficult argument to make, even in 2019. Now, because of the way an epidemic changes the chemistry of our brains, because of the psychological changes wrought worldwide by, first the pandemic and then the associated lockdowns, that argument is much harder to make. And that's why the world into which we emerge is going to be a more protectionist one, and therefore a poorer one. Because countries that try and produce everything themselves make both themselves and their trading partners poorer, right? It may sound superficially plausible to say, well, surely we need to make sure we've got plenty of PPE and ingredients for vaccines and everything. We don't know what's going to come along next. Okay, that's the point. We don't know what the next one's going to be. We could fill every inch of storage, the whole honeycomb of caves we had around our coasts, with all the ingredients necessary for every one of the available coronavirus vaccines, and then something different happens, right? We find we've got all the wrong stuff. The only way in which you maximize utility in this situation is to have maximum specialization and exchange internationally. I'm going to make an effort to go back to first principles and make this argument, at least with you guys at UEA, at least tonight, because somebody has to. And I'm deeply conscious as I talk of how counter-cyclical this is at the moment. But here's the thing. Free trade and free markets have lifted our species to a pinnacle of wealth and happiness that was previously unimaginable. Specialization and exchange have given us technological advantages that previous generations would have attributed to gods or to wizards. You take any metric you like, and there's never been a better time to be a human being than now. You look at literacy, longevity, female education, infant mortality, calorie intake, any metric you like. Free trade was mopping up the last puddles of poverty on the planet. The steepest falls in extreme poverty were happening in precisely those Asian and African countries that were moving away from self-sufficiency and joining global markets. But as I say, that was a pretty hard case to make even before the coronavirus, because it's counterintuitive, right? The anti-free trade case, the mercantilist case, rests on a number of assertions that sound reasonable, even though they all turn out to be specious. Whether they come from Donald Trump or whether they come from Jeremy Corbyn, they sound reasonable. We can't carry on with a trade deficit like this. We need to protect strategic industries. We can't compete with countries that have slave wages. We need to grow more of our own food. All of these things sound reasonable. All of them, when translated into policy, turn out to make a country needlessly poor. A thought about how we get from where we are to where we ought to be. The biggest problem we have, other than the psychological objection to free trade, is that there are interests in every country in trying to distort the global system, to privilege local producers, right? So you think of almost any example of the protectionism we've seen in the last couple of years. I mean, say Donald Trump's steel tariffs, right? It's possible that with those steel tariffs, he has propped up, for now, a small number of jobs in the US steel sector. It is certain that he has cost many more jobs in the downstream industries that use steel, which are vastly more numerous. Jobs in construction, in car making, in aeronautics, and so on. If Donald Trump would, or indeed now, if Joe Biden would have said, you know what, we are happy to buy steel from anywhere in the world, right? If the Chinese are stupid enough to subsidize it, thank you very much, we'll take that as a gift from the Chinese taxpayer to the American consumer. What would happen? Virtually the whole of the US economy would be boosted. All of those car makers and construction workers and so on would have an immediate productivity boost without needing to do anything. Prices would fall, more jobs would be created. And I tell you this as someone who was in politics for 21 years. At the end of that process, not a single American would say, oh, I'm $38 better off because of that. I'm going to vote for the guy who cut the steel tariff. But the losers, small number of workers in Flint, Michigan or whatever, they will know exactly whom to blame and they will vote accordingly. And that is why it happens, right? In one phrase, dispersed gains, concentrated losses. The reason that the price of sugar in the US is twice what it is anywhere else in the world is because sugar cane growers are concentrated in Florida. Florida is a swing state. The sugar lobby in the US makes huge donations to both political parties. And so the US pursues a policy that is massively against its collective national interest, that destroys between 7 and 15 jobs, depending on which measure you take, in food processing and confectionery, but that works for the politicians and the politically connected industries. Let me make one other observation about the difficulty of making the case for globalization and global markets. This is a personal one. I was brought up in Lima, Peru, and Lima, when I was growing up in the 70s, was a city that was ringed by shanty towns, by slums on every surrounding hillside. Barriadas, they were called, las barriadas de Lima. And when I was a kid, people would come, friends, visitors would come from Britain, from the US, from Europe, And they would do the usual thing. They'd stay with us in Lima for a few days, and then they'd go off and do the Inca Trail and go to Machu Picchu, do all the stuff that you do as a tourist. And almost every time, you could almost set your watch by. They'd come back afterwards and they would say, why are people leaving these pristine, beautiful Andean villages and coming to live amid the traffic fumes and the open sewers in these shanty towns? It's a very first world question. No Peruvian ever needed to ask why you would leave a village where there was no clean water, no job, no clinic, no electricity, no school. The people in those shanty towns understood that it was a transitional phase, transitional for them and transitional for the community, that they were on their way to something better. Much later in life, I had occasion to spend time in one of these barriadas. And I have to say, although the standard of living was lower, there was a sense of industriousness and optimism and cheerfulness there that I have not seen in some high unemployment black spots in Europe. Everyone was doing something. You know, they were selling cigarettes at traffic lights, or they were sorting out rubbish for recycling and selling it on. And people had this sense that they were moving on. But although they have it, we, the observers looking from our comfortable perches here, we don't have it, right? So we can indulge effectively an aesthetic dislike of development. I think it was Anthony Trollope, the great Victorian novelist, who said, poverty, to be scenic, should be rural, right? It sounds pretty crude when you put it like that, but I'm afraid that is the sentiment that stands behind an awful lot of Western thinking about development aid. If we want the world to prosper, if we want the poorest places to catch up, the best thing we can do is to buy more of their stuff and sell them more of our stuff, right? Yeah, you wouldn't want to work in a sweatshop in Hanoi. Of course you wouldn't, neither would I. But you and I have not had the alternative of bending our backs in a paddy field, dawn till dusk, day after day, right? Let's allow the people who have taken these jobs the courtesy of assuming that they have agency, that they're capable of making rational decisions, and that they understand, even if we don't, that this is a transitional phase and that they're on their way to better things. Here's the thing, right? I'm going to say it for the final time, and then I'm going to hand over for what I hope will be a discussion, right? All of those were arguments that I was struggling to make 14 months ago. Since then, the board has been so badly tilted against me that I'm certain now that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And the worst of it is this. I wonder, when people talk about the new norm, I wonder whether we haven't got this the wrong way around. I wonder whether the exceptional period through which we passed in the last couple of 100 years of international trade, of globalization, of property rights, of free markets, independent judiciaries, and so on, whether that wasn't the exception, the blip, whether that wasn't always the thing that felt wrong to our inner caveman, that challenged our inherited intuitions. In a way, every movement that has opposed Enlightenment modernism, right? Every movement that has harked back to something purer, less materialistic, whether it's romanticism or existentialism or fascism or communism, all of them have been, one way or another, the cry of our inner caveman, puzzled by this integrated, interconnected modern world. It may be that far from entering into a blip, we're reaching the end of one, that we've just come to the end of an interglacial, and that the ice age beckons ahead, and that really, the new normal was the old normal all along. What was it that Hegel said? The owl of Minerva spreads her wings only with the gathering of the dusk. Perhaps only now, as we lose it, are we going to appreciate what we have.
Thank you very much, Daniel. There's a lot there, some of it about trade and Brexit related, but not all of it, and I hope we can discuss all of it. While the questions come through, I'm going to start by asking something which isn't so much my question. I can see elements of it in the Q&A now, and I can imagine audiences might be thinking this, but you've made a kind of passionate case there for free trade, for comparative advantage, and so on. Now, when we had lots of debates at UEA about during the referendum campaign from all different kinds of sides, and it certainly appeared not just to me that it was the Brexit side in that debate that was urging protectionism, that was worried about jobs being exported overseas, about businesses in the UK being too exposed to European competition. And it was the Remain economists who were saying, don't do this. If we leave the EU, we'll have trade barriers raised and there'll be more tariff barriers. So it seemed to a casual observer, perhaps, people who've been at our UEA talks, that the Brexit side was wanting protectionism and was a bit more worried about globalization, was a reaction against globalization. Yet here you are, one of the leading campaigners, of course, for that and advocates of that, seeming to defend what people thought was the Remain case. So maybe you can explain a little bit more what you're thinking there.
Yes, I mean, I've heard a lot of people say that. That, I have to say, was not my experience. If you look at pretty much every leaflet that Vote Leave put out, free trade was one of the advantages. Whenever the most basic ones we did, 3 reasons to vote Leave or 5 reasons to vote Leave, one of them would always be freer trade. We were arguing that the EU was a protectionist bloc, that it was particularly protectionist in agriculture, but also in coal and steel and textiles and other things. In a way, this was the argument, as you know, that was made even in 1975, that we were being, if you like, ripped out of our natural hinterland of a global market and confined behind a regional tariff wall. But the proof, I mean, look, there were 17 million people who voted Leave, right? So obviously some of them will have been extreme free traders, some of them will have been protectionists, some of them will have been communists, some of them will have been conservatives. There will have been, on both sides, every imaginable combination of political opinions. But I think the proof of this is what are we doing now, right? With Brexit, having these new powers, what are we going to be more or less protectionist than the EU? And the sign so far is that we will be a more free trading country. We have 60 trade deals in place now, which nobody thought could be done, with 64 countries, not counting the one that we have with the EU. The World Trade Organization says that more of our trade is now being liberalized than the EU's is. And we're just getting started. We have trade deals in, I suspect that by June we will have trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. I'm optimistic about the US, but I'm especially optimistic about India. I think we could be the first Western country to have a comprehensive, ambitious trade agreement with that great democracy. And that would be a vindication of what Vote Leave promised. I remember particularly, so I was funny enough, I was just talking about this to a veteran of the campaign this afternoon, and he'd been involved in a subsidiary part of the Vote Leave campaign called Muslims for Britain, which should be the Leave organization for British Muslims. And he'd shown me he had a leaflet which was 5 reasons why British Muslims should vote Leave, 3 of which were the same as in all the other leaflets. One of which was our patriotism. We have long-standing connections to the Commonwealth. But the last was freer trade with our countries of origin. The EU was not a particularly liberal trading partner when it came to a lot of the Commonwealth. And obviously the coronavirus has come in as a massive wrecking ball. It's made all of this much harder for all the reasons that I just gave. And I suspect that the result will be that we go less far than we otherwise would. But I am prepared to predict, now that this is being a recorded webinar, you'll be able to call it up and laugh at me if I'm wrong, but I'm prepared to make a prediction that in a couple of years' time, Britain will have a more open economy, lower tariffs, and a more integrated global economic outlook than the EU has.
So, well, thank you for that clarification. I mean, I suspect there may be more division in the kind of 17 million than you're admitting there, and that might be one of the dynamics in British politics as this plays out. But I'll continue this line with some of the questions that are in the chat, if I can bundle them up, because there's a number here sort of following up on this question about free trade. I mean, so we have, for example, a question from Graham Jeffrey, who says, well, is this an argument for levelling down? Is this going to be about just buying the cheapest where we can get it and workers' rights will suffer? But somebody else, Neil Harper, asks, well, what limits would you place on free trade with other partners who don't play by the rules. And someone else thinks, if free trade is in our interest, should we be selling arms to Saudi Arabia? So maybe you want to answer those specifics, but the broader question is, well, are there limits to this free trade vision that you have?
Well, let me try and deal with those. So I've never understood when cheap became an insult, right? Things getting cheaper is why we have, is why people in poor countries have bicycles and access to inoculation programs and school books. You never hear cheap used in that way among the 70% of human beings who struggle to afford a washing machine, right? The idea that lower prices means lower standards or lower wages or a lower standard of living, I just think is demonstrably false, right? I'm constantly struck by this. Singapore is a place that has very few regulations, very cheap prices, barely makes anything, as I said earlier, imports everything. And yet, I think there is absolutely no question that you would rather be poor in Singapore than in the UK, or indeed virtually anywhere else in the world, right? If you look at longevity, if you look at healthcare outcomes, public education, public transport, the idea that an open and deregulated economy means a low wage economy is just false. It is visibly untrue. And yet, weirdly, we've got this idea that cutting prices somehow means that you want some sort of Dickensian sweatshop economy. I guess that's probably another of those intuitive things that isn't true. What limits should you put on free trade? It's really fascinating, isn't it, to ask the question that way around, right? It seems to me that there should be a basic presumption the other way around, right? Alan, you want to sell me something, I want to buy it. You're happy with the terms of our contract, I'm happy with the terms of our contract. There should be a very good reason before the full coercive force of the law is invoked to prevent you from selling me the thing that I want to buy from you. And the fact that you happen to be in another country does not strike me as a good reason, right? So all that, if you like, the free traders are saying is don't discriminate against otherwise legal produce purely because it happens not to be sited on your territory. So what are the limits? Look, I mean, you still have laws about what you can do in this country, right? There are laws, for example, about whether you can buy a gun, which are different here to what they are in the United States. No one is suggesting that a free trade deal would change those things. Those are an issue for domestic legislation. But when something is legal, when something can be fairly bought and sold, it seems to me quite extraordinary to say you shouldn't be allowed to sell it on the same terms simply because of what it says on your passport. And for me, one of the oddest things is that, this has now become broadly an argument that you hear from the centre right, and that's quite a new development. You referenced Alan comparative advantage. I didn't, but David Ricardo, the father of comparative advantage, very typically for free traders of his generation, was a radical. He spent his life campaigning for a wider franchise, diminution of church and monarchical power, abolition of the slave trade. Same with Adam Smith, same with almost all free traders, because they correctly understood that protectionism was a racket which allowed the rich to subsidize themselves at the expense of the poor. And one of the weirdest products of the affluence of modern Western society is that we've lost that argument, that people don't care about it anymore, even though it still hugely applies in other countries. As for selling arms to the Saudis, you may well want to prohibit instruments of internal repression. You prohibit them here, you wouldn't want to sell them to the Saudis or to anyone else. But I would caution very strongly against the use of generalized trade sanctions as an instrument of foreign policy. Take it away from Saudi Arabia. It could be any country, it could be Burma, it could be China, could be whatever you like, right? There are various things you can do to signal your disapproval of another country, to put pressure on them. There are sanctions you can take against individuals. General trade sanctions are not just useless, they are counterproductive. They almost always have the opposite effect of the one intended. They hurt the wrong people, ordinary folk in the other country and in your own, and they drive support for the regime of which you disapprove, right? Because they create a siege mentality and they allow an autocratic government to excuse its failure. I am absolutely certain that Fidel Castro would have fallen from power decades ago had it not been for the American blockade. The American blockade allowed he and his successors to say to Cubans, the reason that you are all so poor is not because Marxism-Leninism is a crappy economic system that delivers poor outcomes, it's because we're under siege from this Yankee blockade, right? Putin knows this very well. That's why he keeps picking fights with us that trigger sanctions. It keeps the Russian people in a state of anxious patriotism, which makes them likely to vote for him. So whatever sanctions you want to take, whether it's against Russia or China or whoever, they should be keyhole surgery rather than hacking around with a cleaver. And any kind of generalized trade sanction, of which not signing a trade deal is the mildest form, is hacking around with a cleaver.
So I'm going to pursue this line for a little bit because I see other questions and I'm still trying to divine the audience mind a little here. But I wonder, you said at the start there that it's odd, isn't it, people complaining about things being cheap. But I suppose the concern might be something like, well, if some things come in very cheaply, that's going to it's going to put regional local producers out of business. It's going to lose jobs. It maybe it lowers wages. So there will be a concern, one, about just generally lower wages, which might develop into a concern about if there are low wages, how they're going to buy the stuff that's coming in, no matter how cheap. So I think there's partly that sort of concern, but also, and in a way, you touched on it when you said, well, we shouldn't sell weapons of oppression to states. Some people might be thinking, well, this is great. We want improved economic trade and exchange, but not everything is about economic life. There are other things in social, cultural, personal life that we want to protect, and we worry about the ways in which a lack of regulation might intrude on protecting things of that conservatives might be expected to want to protect in terms of our heritage and so forth. And I partly raise that because there's also a question about climate and consumption, the worry that, for example, Singapore's cheap prices might stimulate consumption in ways that are harmful, maybe economically beneficial, but harmful to other things that we think of as being important, like climate. Okay. So that's a whole bunch of things, but you get the general sense there of people worried about wages, the effect on, but also the effect on things beyond the economy.
Sure. Well, let me start with the wages point. So this was one of Donald Trump's favorite arguments. You know, we've got to reshore staff because they're killing us on trade, was the phrase he used. They're eating our lunch. You know, they're driving down wages. And then in the next tweet, he would say, record employment figures, you know, record living standard, and they couldn't both be true, right? There was a direct, I mean, he didn't care, but there was a direct contradiction between saying globalization is lowering living standards and look, we've got this economic miracle going on. And it was the first that was untrue, right? This argument has been made for as long as there's been technological advance. When agriculture became mechanized, it first started becoming mechanized in the kind of 18th century, people said, oh, the real jobs are on the land. There won't be, these so-called newfangled factories aren't going to employ enough people. Wages will collapse, will be surrounded, overrun by vagabonds was the word that they used in that era, sturdy beggars and so on. And of course it didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is worth analyzing. The reason it didn't happen is that up until then, you'd had to work very long hours just to provide yourself with the basics. Once people found ways of producing food more efficiently, that freed up a lot of people who previously had to work in food production to go and do other things. And what did they do? Well, they started creating industries for things for which there'd previously not been any demand, things that no one had dreamed of until then. And foreign visitors to the UK, which pioneered this free trade policy, were astonished by the high living standard of ordinary people, which is something that had never really happened in the world until then. Ordinary people on low to medium incomes in the 19th century could afford more than one change of clothes and watches and glass windows and porcelain and cutlery. And those things were being produced in these newfangled factories for which there'd previously been no demand because everyone had just been working all day to feed themselves. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter once put it beautifully. He said, the achievement of capitalism is not to provide more silk stockings for princesses. It's to bring them within the reach of shopgirls. And that's the great thing about free exchange. As it lowers prices, it's the only system that makes you direct your activity at the general market. Under every other system, you get on by sucking up to people in power, to kings or priests or commissars or whatever it is. Capitalism uniquely rewards you for offering a service, yes, cheaply, affordably, to people whose lives you massively improve by doing that. And that's why it's gone hand in hand with these living standards. Now, you might say, did say a second ago, but what about all the intangible stuff? I might care very much about animal welfare, or I might care very much about traditional artisan ways of producing something, or I might care very much about landscape and so on. Right, those are not issues that you tack onto a trade deal, right? If you've got, this is an argument I'm constantly having with trade officials, right? If you've got concerns about climate change, women's rights, preservation of habitats, whatever the thing, make a treaty about that, right? My point is not that they're unimportant, it's the opposite. It's that they are too important to tack on as a coda to a trade deal. A trade deal should be about removing obstacles to trade and then allowing people to make informed, reasonable judgments. So, I would, to criticize my own government for a moment, I think it is wrong in principle for us to say we shouldn't buy foie gras. I wouldn't buy foie gras. I find it, I think that the balance of, the balance of utility doesn't add up, right? The mild difference between eating foie gras and eating an alternative does not justify the suffering inflicted. But that should be my decision. It shouldn't be a decision that I then impose with the full force of coercive law on everyone who doesn't agree with me. And I think it is quite important in all this to remember the right of personal choice and the power of personal responsibility.
So, well, maybe continuing that thought about independence, individual responsibility, and so forth. So, another concern that's coming up in the questions, which touches, I think, on these issues in a deep way, is a question about monopolies. I mean, that's, you'll know that as as an argument in economics. But the suggestion here is that there are lots of powerful monopolies now. Amazon, Facebook is what the questioner Ben Little mentions. These have tremendous power. And states can sometimes be put under the thumb by these powerful monopolies. And the EU gave an opportunity for strength in numbers to protect against them. So here, I guess the question is, how are we going to protect ourselves against that big tech? Is there and there's a concern that we might be too exposed, unable to protect the things we want to protect, not just protectionist, but protect from these kind of forces. So how would you answer that?
You know what those monopolists fear and hate more than anything else is open competition. They become monopolists by exploiting lobbying power. That's why they are the most determined to retain distortions in both domestic legislation and international trade, right? So I mean, let's take the example of the big tech giants, the Googles and the Facebooks and so on. They enjoy an absolutely extraordinarily privileged position in law, because they are not liable for what they run. So they're treated as platforms in that sense, but they're treated as publishers in the sense that they have editorial control. They can both decide that they're going to ban UEA because they don't like one of the courses it's run, and that they may not be subject to any action from the people that they ban. Now, that's not some natural monopoly. That is a piece of legislation that gave them this privileged position. And the best way of destroying a monopoly is to take away all of these bits of legislation that give people a privileged position. And the reason that doesn't happen is because certain industries have political pull. And that is a very good example of one. An even more extreme example of one is agriculture, right? Agriculture has political pull out of all proportion to its importance, because we're all sentimental about it, right? It occupies a special place. We care much more about farmers than we do about call center workers, right? It's just one of those things. When we're 3-year-olds, we read books about farmers and smiling livestock. We don't usually read books about about any kind of unsubsidized private sector worker, apart from Bob the Builder, for whom I've always had a commensurate soft spot. So the result of that is that we tend to take pretty much at its word the kind of NFU arguments that are just nakedly about producer capture. Whereas the correct thing, going back to distinguish what's important to you from trade, the correct thing would be to say, if we value the countryside, if we want to have all these beautiful fields around Norwich, not to do an accidental partridge, then the way of doing it is to subsidize them. It's to subsidize the stewardship, right? Pay people to maintain the hedgerows or the ditches or whatever you have in Norfolk, to get people recognize the service that they are fulfilling to the rest of us, keeping this Commonwealth intact. But don't confuse that with food production. That is a separate thing. You don't preserve pretty British countryside by keeping out New Zealand lamb. You preserve it by deciding what's worth preserving and paying for that directly.
So there's an interesting question here, I think, which touches on that, but also returns us to some of the larger issues. Sean Hargreaves Heap here asks if he thinks, says, is this account of the benefits of the division of labour through the market a bit oversimplified? Adam Smith, like others who see the extraordinary virtues of markets, also recognise their vices, i.e. market failure. I'm not sure, for example, that Amazon has just got its position because of cozying up to regulators. There are structures and patterns within particular sectors that can lead to outcomes that we might call market failures in some way. And so consequently, as he says, if recognised, there's a rather trickier task of deciding on the boundaries of the market, both its limits, but also trying to create markets where there might be monopolies growing. So, I mean, are you not simplifying this a little bit with a kind of insistence on particular idea of free markets that rather prevents us from addressing the complexities and nuances of what we're trying to do when we govern our economic relations together?
Well, I'll tell you, Alan, the thing that most surprised me when I was first elected to the European Parliament in 1999, the thing that really shocked me as a free market conservative was the extent to which big business loved regulation. I had rather innocently supposed, I suppose because I've sort of drunk in the narrative before as a civilian, that business people would be kind of impatient to shake off the shackles of needless rules and get on and compete. Not a bit of it. Not a bit of it. Because, of course, everyone is a natural monopolist if they get the chance. Every businessman will take a privilege if he's offered it. What they all wanted was regulation whose compliance costs they could easily assimilate, but that their rivals couldn't. And I lost count of how many times I saw this. The attempt to use the regulatory process to erect barriers to entry and to keep out competition. So, but it was never, obviously they weren't idiots, so they would never sell it like that. They would always portray it as being about public health or environmental protection or something. But that was never what it was. It was there was a standard that they happened to meet anyway, and they saw a lovely opportunity to make that standard a legal requirement and put all of their competitors out of business. And I watched that over 20 years unfolding. Almost, I don't think I ever saw an example of where a business was arguing for freer. And actually, no, I saw one. There was one. I can think of one example of where somebody came and said, a rival is getting an unfair subsidy. We don't want a subsidy. We just want no subsidies. Once in 21 years. And this is a point that I think is very often missed on the right and on the left. There is an immense difference between being pro-business and being pro-market, right? Sometimes the two will happen to coincide, but often they don't. And no one gains more from regulations and distortions than the big multinationals that spend so much time lobbying for them. No one gains more from their elimination than the poorest people on the planet.
So questions are coming kind of thick and fast, and very good ones. I wish we were in a seminar together and had all day to address them. Let me just get into something a bit more specific now, because there's a couple of questions here more specifically relating to where we are around Brexit and trade. So Chris Sexton here says by leaving the EU, we significantly impeded our trade relations with the world's largest trading entity. Have we so far managed to establish better trade relations with any country? If so, which one? And Graham Jeffrey says, aren't the trade deals we've signed almost universally just rollover arrangements with what we had as a member of the EU? So there's a part of the question about, okay, how are we doing better? But Graham Jeffrey also says, how do you then account for the drop in exports generally at the moment? Is that just the pandemic, or can we not already see the effects of that withdrawal from that trade bloc?
Well, I mean, I think that the last one was largely the pandemic, because it was a January drop. Remember that France imposed a blockade on the UK because of the Kent variant in the new year. So there was. I mean, of course, there was going to be a trade drop. It was literally illegal to cross the channel, and there were all those poor Romanian truck drivers who couldn't get home, and I'm sure you can all remember that. It has significantly bounced back since then. However, it is fair to say that there has already been a noticeable shift away from the EU, both in terms of imports and exports. We've returned to what I think were always probably our slightly more natural markets. But I think it is fair to say that a lot of the trade deals we had, for now, largely replicate EU terms, although in small but important ways they go further. And that's because, frankly, we have capacity issues. Okay? We've come to trade policy for the first time in half a century. We have no institutional memory. Prior to Brexit, we had no trade department. You know, I sit on the board of trade, which is, as you correctly said, 400 years old this year. But since 1972, it existed only on paper. It had no meetings. It had nothing to do, because all of our trade policy was, of course, done on our behalf by the EU. And so that, I'm afraid, has just created a certain backlog. We have bandwidth issues, and a decision was made accordingly that we should prioritize trade talks with countries with whom we did not inherit anything from the EU. So for the sake of time, because we're wanting to concentrate on Australia, New Zealand, the US, India, and so on, Mercosur, I hope, later this year, to save time, where we inherited a perfectly serviceable deal with, you know, South Korea or Turkey or whatever, we would basically, the approach was to say, let's leave this more or less as it is, with a clear promise that we will come back and try and be more comprehensive and more ambitious within the next 2 years. Even within that, it's worth noting that we have gone further in small but important ways. We've tried wherever possible to give a token of intent, to show the other party that we mean it. So that, you know, we have a slightly more liberal regime on buying Egyptian strawberries. We have a slightly more liberal regime on some agri-food exports from the former Soviet countries and so on. We've tried to signal that the promise to come back to this is for real. It's not, you know, it's just that we have only so many officials. And in some of them, we have gone quite significantly further. So the last EU trade deal that we inherited, the very last one as a member, was with Japan. When we looked at the details of the EU-Japan deal, they didn't really cover many of the things that we were interested in. It was heavily weighted towards the agrarian and heavy industrial interests on the continent. It didn't have much to say about what we wanted, which was financial services in particular, services more generally, investor protection mechanisms and so on, cross-border data flows. So we have, in our rollover with Japan, we've massively upgraded in a number of those areas. And they, like we are, a service-based modern economy. That's where the growth is, right? The headlines are all about beef, but the money is all in things like data flows. And so already, I would argue, we've gone beyond where we were.
So there's a question here, which I'm going to take from Alfie Penfold. Alfie asks how you account for the undeniable rise in inequality in the UK, in particular the explosion of food bank usage post 2010. But I'm going to put that question into a context to sort of make you give a larger answer, because it seems to me we might say, well, yes, there were before Brexit, before the Brexit deal, some problems with the UK economy, declining wages, over-reliance on debt fuel consumption, we might say, underinvestment, a range of issues. So, and including inequality. So how does the free trade post-Brexit vision you're outlining kind of address those problems of the British economy? Because surely you're not going to argue they were all problems just caused by excessive protectionism since 1992. And don't we need more nuanced ways of addressing problems in particular sectors and thinking about our economy in the round. Because someone else also asked, well, what's our natural market? And I wonder, you've talked about Australia and New Zealand. What is it that we're going to sell to them that we weren't already selling?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm afraid I'm going to take issue with Alfie's adjective undeniable. I think it's highly deniable. There is actually a formal measure, isn't there? It's the Gini coefficient, and by that measure, we were becoming a more equal. So we were already an equal, a relatively equal society by global standards, and we were becoming more so. I'm struck over and over again in this debate by how many people begin with their conclusions and then cast around for a way to justify them. So a lot of people start with the assumption that we must be becoming a more unequal society. We're constantly, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. This was, by the way, this was a theory invented by Karl Marx. He called it his theory of immiseration. I'm not saying people are aware that they're quoting him, but that's what they're doing. It wasn't true when he wrote it, and it's not true now. Yes, the rich have got richer, and the poor have got richer faster. But of course, if the statistics don't show that, and by the way, the recent recession caused by COVID has been a big equalizer, right? It's protected people on low wages much more than private sector people on high wages. If the statistics don't show that, you will find some way of sustaining your starting assumption. Oh, what about food banks? Well, food banks didn't exist until 2004. So of course there are more of them now than there in 2004. That doesn't prove that poverty has risen, right? If food banks were a measure of poverty, then Germany would be a much poorer country than Bangladesh, right? And indeed, the Trussell Trust who run established the food bank say, for goodness sake, it's not a measure of poverty. It's a new technology that we're able to use because of better flows of information. I mean, it'd be extraordinary if I said the fact that we have more mobile phones is the only measure of wealth. I mean, there weren't mobile phones 15 years ago, so of course there are more of them, right? The same thing. So I'm afraid I don't buy, although I don't expect to convince people if they want to think otherwise. But I don't buy that we're getting more uneven. What I would try and convince people of is that the biggest beneficiaries of freer trade are people on low incomes. Right? The highest tariffs that were imposed by the EU were on food, clothing, and footwear. Now, all of us will benefit from those tariffs coming down, but people on low incomes spend a higher proportion of the weekly budget on those items. And so the proportionate benefit to people on low incomes is much higher. And this is true almost always of trade liberalization. It benefits everyone, but the biggest benefits are felt by people who are less privileged. So, and this, by the way, was well understood and was a big part of the Labour Party programme really up until the war. One of the most extraordinary things was that transformation that Snowden and the Labour Party of the 20s and 30s used to campaign very strongly on the phrase they had in those days was the free breakfast table. Make sure we don't have tariffs on basic commodities that working people spend a lot of their income on. And they were absolutely right to make that argument. It was, protectionism was a way of transferring wealth from the poor to the rich in this country. At some point, that changed, I think partly because there was a kind of trade union capture. So Labour became a more producer rather than consumer-oriented party. And then there came this really odd movement, which has been in my lifetime, this belief that somehow free trade means, rapacious Western corporates exploiting poor countries. When actually it's really exactly the opposite. The best thing you can do to encourage the rise in living standards in poor countries is to have a multiplicity of different foreign operators able to compete against each other so that they have to start offering higher wages and better terms to local workers. And we went through the industrialization first. We were the first country in the world to do it, and it's, I think, scarred us ever since, because we didn't know that there was a way out. But when Vietnam or Peru or someone goes through it now, they do know that there's a way out because they've seen it happen to us. And that's why they're so much more sanguine about free trade than we are.
To come back to that question about the bigger picture of the British economy, what problems
Oh,
there
yes.
were before Brexit is going to
Yes.
solve, and that would include inequality. I mean, inequality, wealth inequality, asset inequality is increasing. That distorts certain markets in the country, and property most obviously, but not only. So there are these bigger issues to be addressed. Can they just be addressed by lifting all protection? Don't we need to kind of think about how we develop particular sectors? And that touches on this question of what you've called the natural trading partners.
Yeah.
Daniel Wincott here asks about, well, why are these the limits of
Sure.
our trade? But what are we going to sell to them, I think, is the question.
Okay.
No, that's
Okay, so I'm often asked that. What are we going to sell? I mean, again, just to use the example, who saw these coming before they came, right? I mean, if I knew now what is going to be the next equivalent of this, I'd be a very rich man. But you know what? Someone is already working on the prototype. Someone's already got it in the development stage. When you say, especially when you say to a politician, "What are we going to sell?" That's begging the question. The politician is the last person who should decide what we're going to sell. The politician's job is to create a system of secure property rights, secure intellectual property, so that whoever it is who develops the thing for which there is a market, could be cheap flights, could be could be Netflix, I don't know, that they are able to do so with a relative certainty that they're not going to be expropriated or confiscated in some way. What are our natural markets? Look, again, I don't know, and no one knows for sure. People will make a reasoned guess. I would just make the observation that in the 1970s, as the EU's common external tariff was imposed in phases, there was a massive distortion of our trade away from a mixed market that the previous Commonwealth system had brought together agrarian economies, commodity-based economies, manufacturing economies, service-based economies. It allowed people to swap on the back of differences. We left that system largely. We had to impose European tariffs on a lot of those countries, and instead we joined 6 relatively similar advanced Western European economies. And I think that from the most basic purpose of trade being to exchange, to get stuff that you can't produce yourself without excessive cost, that was always a questionable decision. It became more questionable when we saw that the Commonwealth promptly took off and that we had joined the EEC just as it stopped growing in the early 70s. But I used these arguments during the referendum. I used to say that the rest of the world is growing faster than Europe. Distance doesn't matter so much these days. We need to be where the markets are. I think those arguments have become truer now than they were before the coronavirus hit us, in 2 senses. First, we talk about it as a pandemic, a global pandemic. Europe has been much worse hit than Asia or Africa or the Antipodes, right? So the relative slow growth of Europe has been exacerbated by the events of the past 14 months. No one's fault, and it was, it was an acceleration of something that was already going on. But it does make much stronger the case for Britain increasing its trade with the Pacific Rim and the growing parts of the world. Second thing that's changed, we are now much more accustomed to doing what we're doing now, right? We are all far more used now than we were a year ago to conducting even important and sensitive conversations like this through the medium of Zoom or Teams. And so in such a world, I don't think if all the restrictions were lifted tomorrow, I don't think that people would be nearly as ready as they were to fly over to Dusseldorf for the day to make a presentation. Once you are dealing commercially online, cultural proximity begins to trump geographical proximity. And it becomes easier for you to do a deal with a business in New Zealand on the other side of the world, which uses the same accountancy system as yours, the same regulatory method, the same legal system, same common, if it's a dispute, it'll be arbitrated in the way that they both understand it. It's English speaking. It becomes easier to do a deal with a firm in Dunedin on the other side of the world than with Dunkirk, where none of those things is true, despite 40 years of harmonization. So for all of those reasons, I think that Britain, even if we'd stayed in the EU, the EU percentage of our trade would have continued to shrink. But that process, I think, will now naturally accelerate.
Okay, I'm going to sort of shift tack a little bit here because these questions have been about that sort of second part of your talking about Brexit. There was a whole first part of the talk that we haven't picked up, but you touched on it there by saying about how things have changed for using Zoom, and maybe some questions will come up on this. But you made this strong argument that it was part of our sort of desire for tribal belonging had been activated by the COVID situation, that we would want authoritarian government. So while people formulate questions about that, let me kind of push back on that and say, well, yes, I may have heard some people say they missed the lockdown. There are not that many. But when they do say something like that, I don't think they mean they want protection, authoritarian government. What they mean is they've been reminded that it can be quite nice to be where you live, that your local area and your local community is good, that to see a bit of nature back in the cities is a good thing, and to not be entirely caught up in acquisitive commercial side of life, endlessly commuting, endlessly working, to be back with family and have some stuff, not because they're anti-economy or anti-growth, but because there are other things in life. And it seems to me that's part of what people might be feeling.
But who's going to disagree with that?
Well, I'm wondering, because you seem to be saying that actually that sense of some kind of benefits of lockdown was really all part of the negative side of tribal.
That's not what I'm saying. So according to, there was an Ipsos Mori poll done with King's College London, 54% of people are going to miss some aspects of lockdown. Now, of course, on one level, what you've just said is unarguable, right? I mean, who wouldn't rather spend time at home than commute every day? Who wouldn't rather spend time with their kids than in an office, you know? But when we're talking about the lockdown, we're not talking about the freedom to balance your life differently. We're talking about using the full force of the law to oblige you to do it and to oblige all your neighbors to do the same thing, right? You and I have everyone has the opportunity to say, I'm going to make different choices. I'm going to, I don't mind not going on holiday if the flip side of that is working slightly shorter hours, right? We can do that. You don't need the massive coercive power of the lockdown to be able to make that decision. But I'm afraid that distinction has been rather lost. And the distinction between I disapprove of this thing and this thing should be banned has rather gone by the wayside. But if you think about it, the difference between those two things is, that difference contains the entirety of what we mean by a free society.
But I'm hoping more questions will come on this side of things, but I'm going to try again. I suppose people might say, well, that argument has some force, but there's a flip side to it, which is that if because of our lack of or because of our reluctance to have regulations economically, the coal mine closes down, the Amazon warehouse is built instead, that's going to have a profound effect on the life and experience of that community, but they didn't have anything that they could do about that. So we're saying, on the one hand, well, state isn't going to come in and do these things because that's too authoritarian to kind of to stop COVID spreading, but it's also not going to do these things that are going to leave you at the mercy of other forces that are more powerful than you. And what about isn't politics there precisely so communities can say, hang on a minute, no, there are some other things we value.
So that's a really big, important question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it at length. First of all, the idea that there is this tension between materialism and other things, the phrase work-life balance. There is an imaginary group of people who, in the fancies of their opponents, in the heated brains of the people who decry them, somehow get more pleasure out of having a healthy bank balance than they do out of listening to Beethoven or going for a walk in the countryside or playing with their kids. Right? Honestly, I have never met such a person. I struggle to imagine that such a person exists. But it's important to understand what economic progress means. It basically is a way of freeing up time. It's a way of allowing us to make more decisions because of technological advance. So the fact that you have a dishwasher means you can now switch it on and go for that walk in the country that you otherwise couldn't. The fact that you're able to drive to work instead of taking 2 trams and a bus means that you have time to listen to that Beethoven symphony. The fact that you don't have to work 6 days a week just to feed your kids means that you are able to spend the weekend playing with them, right? So the idea that there is a conflict between increasing living standards and the important things in life, I think, is the opposite of the truth. It's those time-saving advances that give us all of the things that we value. But let me deal with your coal mines point, which I think is a very widespread one, right? And I'm gonna answer this at length if you don't mind, because I think I suspect a lot of people watching have we're cheering you on, right, as you ask. When I was a member of the European Parliament, I covered an area that had very little by way of heavy industry. My region was southeast England, fairly affluent, service-based, some light industry. There were not a lot of steel mills or coal mines. So there was one big exception, which was the old dockyard at Chatham. Classic bit of heavy industry, employed 12,000 people at peak. And it closed, I think, in 1984, at exactly the time when the coal mines and the steel mills were closing in the Midlands and the North. And, even when I was there were people who'd never forgotten and couldn't forgive. And I don't blame them. I mean, if you're, you're in your 40s and you've got a decent life as a welder and you've got a structure and so on, and then literally through no fault of yours, all of that goes and the only work available is as a security guard. Of course you can be angry about it. I would be. Who wouldn't be? But it's important that we tell this story right through to the end. Going into the lockdown, unemployment in that constituency was 1.2%. There are now more people working on the territory of the old dockyards than there were when it was a dockyard. And what are they doing? Some of it is kind of industrial heritage tourism. Some of it is the University of Medway, right? And who watching this can doubt that that is a good and worthy service to be providing? But the biggest employer there is the audiovisual sector. Is where they may call them midwife. It's where they made Sherlock as a big. Now, are we really saying that it would have been better for the people tapping at those screens still to be bashing metal for a living? My maternal grandfather worked in a shipyard on the Clyde in the west of Scotland. And he had a typical unhealthy west of Scotland lifestyle, smoked heavily, died when he was, I think, 61, with the result that I never met him, right? So I never had the chance to ask him whether he would have wanted to keep that shipyard open at whatever cost to others in order to keep the kind of community going. But I've got a pretty shrewd idea that if he could see me and my cousins tapping at a screen for a living, he would not hesitate for a moment.
So I'm not getting tons of questions on the COVID thing, but which is a shame, because I think that is, there's a very interesting set of questions about how it's going to change our expectations, understandings of politics, our cultural outlooks. I suspect it's going to be very significant, but I think alongside Brexit rather than more than. But we'll go back to some of the issues more specifically related to our kind of political situation in Brexit. There's actually a question I didn't take that arrived before we even started talking, which was about kind of Euroscepticism. And is there a place for Euroscepticism anymore? So that's been a key part of British politics for a long time, in part thanks to you. Is that now done and dusted with, or is there still a place for Euroscepticism? I think it's an interesting question in British politics, or for that kind of perspective that is not just specific about the EU, but is thinking about the EU's place in the world and is thinking about these kinds of international arrangements. Does Euroscepticism become sceptical of other kinds of international organisations and international arrangements? Because it would seem to me there is potentially a market in politics for that sort of position. I don't know if that's your position, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be a discussion about national sovereignty, right? And that will be true whether you're talking about, the International Criminal Court or the Landmines Treaty or whatever. There's always going to be the question of where do you draw the balance between national democratic governments and things that you have to do collectively. But I think Euroscepticism, as it has existed, well, certainly since it sort of came into force in its modern form in the early 90s, but I think even since the late 60s when it first got going, I think that is over. If I'm looking for any silver lining of this ghastly lockdown, it's that it finally ended the culture war. The culture war that began, weirdly, after the referendum rather than during it. I was out campaigning pretty much every day in the run-up to and during that referendum. speaking at public meetings, running street stalls. And, very often we would run into the other side with their stronger in blue t-shirts, and we'd pose for selfies together and we'd wish each other luck. It was still essentially a civil disagreement. It was a disagreement about sovereignty, trade, migration, borders, et cetera, and money. But it was still within the realm of empirical discussion where you could try and change someone's mind. At some point very soon after the result came in, it may simply have been the shock of the result for people who hadn't expected it, I don't know. But it stopped being about issues and it became tribal. It became about what kinds of people do we imagine are on the other side, the kind of people that we don't like, right? And then depending on which side you were on, delete as appropriate, right? We don't like the ignorant working class oafs who fell for unscrupulous demagogues, or we don't like the sneering snobs who secretly hate their own country. And once it becomes like that, compromise becomes almost impossible because it's not about issues anymore. It's about tribal identity. Both sides get into this purity spiral where they start saying more and more extreme things because they're only talking to their own side. I was, for want of a better shorthand, a fairly soft Brexiteer. I thought that the best outcome for us would have been some kind of EFTA solution where we withdrew from the political institutions but stayed in some of the market ones. When the result came in, I was on the Dimbleby results program at 6 a.m. when it became clear, and I said, this is 48-52. 2 of the home nations have voted to stay in, 2 have voted to leave, so we've got to be cautious, got to be moderate, got to try and carry everyone with us. We will end up keeping some of the existing arrangements and opting out of others. It'll be a process, not an event. And I absolutely believe that was going to happen. I couldn't see how else you would interpret a 52-48 result. It rapidly became clear that the polarization was on both sides. That EFTA option was as unacceptable to Remainers who deliberately destroyed it because they thought they could have a second referendum, as it was to those Leavers who then turned it into a kind of virility test of, we won, why do you want any links? And what had been a really very mainstream position suddenly became, one held by me and about 6 other people in the country. And that was the real tragedy. Maybe I should have foreseen it, but I didn't. The way in which the centre collapsed almost immediately in the days after the vote. And it wasn't until the wrecking ball of the coronavirus came in that culture war, that bitter tribal polarization was replaced by something else.
Well, sticking with a different kind of divisiveness, because some questions have been asked about it. Though I think what you're saying is fascinating there, and there's an interesting history to be written about how that came out and where we're going to go. But part of the continuing fallout of that is in Northern Ireland, and an anonymous question was asked a couple of questions about Northern Ireland, about the protocol, and about how you see Northern Ireland, particularly because you talked to various points about Britain's role in the world. There's an ambiguity there about where Northern Ireland is in that. So perhaps you could speak to those issues.
Yeah, I don't feel at all ambiguous about Northern Ireland. I think, unless and until the people of Northern Ireland decide to do something different, Northern Ireland is a full part of the UK. That's basic democracy, and I'm glad to say that all sides signed up to that, right? So the essence of the 1998 deal is that all the parties in Northern Ireland and in Dublin and in Westminster all agreed that it was up to the people of Northern Ireland to decide. So I think it is important that Northern Ireland should benefit from the same trade deals that the UK does. That's written into the Northern Ireland Protocol. However, I think the Northern Ireland Protocol should never have been signed. And it's significant to me that no one in Brussels ever thought we would sign it. It was not tabled until the end of 2017, after the 2017 election result. It would not have occurred to the Brussels negotiators to ask Britain to surrender jurisdiction over part of its territory. It was only when there was a clear majority against Brexit in the House of Commons that the idea got around that, look, if we make the terms ugly enough, they might drop the whole thing, that this proposal was put on the table. But it rests on something that is absurd, not just anomalous, but insupportable, which is the idea that any kind of checks on goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland would undermine the Good Friday Agreement and possibly even threaten the peace, but that exactly the same checks on goods between Northern Ireland and Great Britain will have no effect at all. Now, that is a plainly absurd situation, and I just don't think it's sustainable. Either it will need to be modified with the EU's agreement, which would of course be my preference, or it will have to be abolished.
So we're coming towards the end of our time. So what I'm going to do is kind of partly pick up on what you've just said there, but there are still things to be resolved in the relationship between the UK and the EU. Some of them technical, to do with the agreement and trade, to do with the protocol, things to be reviewed. With that sort of in mind, but also thinking about your broader issues that you raised, and the topic of our talk, what's Dan Hannan's utopia? I think we've got some glimpses of it, but in 5 years' time, let's say utopia is going to be just 5 years away. What are you hoping to see? What would be your utopia when it comes to the dust finally settled, the political culture in the UK? I mean, it won't be settled, but let's imagine that would be my utopia, just it would be settled. And these issues around Northern Ireland, the protocol, and the final sort of resting place of our relationship with the EU. What's Dan Hannan's utopia?
Yeah, well, I mean, Dan Hannan definitely does not have a utopia. I don't believe in either the original Thomas More utopia, which was, of course, the code word that British communists used to use for the Soviet Union, or indeed the notion of perfectibility, right? Man is fallen. This is an imperfect, broken, Aristotelian, sublunary world. We do not do perfection. And I am deeply suspicious of any politician who promises utopia, because it almost always ends up with broken bodies and a police state. But what is an achievable, happy outcome vis-a-vis the European Union? Since we were just talking about Ireland, let me make this parallel. When the Irish Free State left the UK almost exactly 100 years ago, it initially came with all sorts of constraints and obligations. There was an oath of supremacy to the crown. There were these 3 treaty ports. There were residual fiscal transfers. And this was partly because London could not easily make the psychological adjustment to having a genuinely independent country next door. They wanted to believe that Ireland was still in some way a protectorate. And now, if you like, it's the other way around. Now it's Brussels that finds it difficult to accept a genuinely independent country next door, rather than a country with the same sort of status as Albania or Ukraine or something, where they're sort of within the orbit of EU jurisdiction. That changed eventually because the personnel changed. Once the people who'd been involved in the war had moved on in London, and others came fresh to the task, they were much readier to look at it in terms of practical interests. And Ireland, technically in breach of all the treaties, was able to move towards a fully Republican constitution with barely a peep of protest. I mean, it wasn't just that that Britain couldn't enforce these conditions anymore. It's no one cared anymore, and that opened the door eventually to a long overdue reconciliation of the peoples within the British Isles. And by the early 2000s, we'd moved back to where 2 kindred neighboring countries should have been right from the start. That, I think, is an achievable future for Britain and the EU. We have a continuing interest in the prosperity of our European neighbours. Right? First, they're our friends, they're our old allies. Second, we have a selfish interest, right? We want to have rich customers next door. We want them to be rich so they buy more of our stuff. We want to be able to go on holiday there and all that. We want them to succeed. And I think that logic applies the other way around. It will take a while before the people on whose watch Brexit happened overcome their sense of being affronted, but it will happen.
Well, with that hopeful note, I'd like to bring proceedings to a close, and I'd like to do that by thanking everybody for coming, for giving us your time and giving us your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't ask every single one, but I hope we touched on most of them in some way. I'd particularly like to thank Dan. It's a shame we can't all give a thunderous round of applause, but we should thank him for his time, for coming in and standing up to the robust questioning that you put him through. This was the first lecture in a series, so do join us in a fortnight's time on Tuesday the 11th of May for a talk which follows on very nicely from what Dan has just said, because on 11th of May we'll be welcoming John Bruton, former Taoiseach of Ireland. He was Prime Minister of Ireland at a very crucial moment in the preparation of what would become the Good Friday Agreement. So it will be very interesting to hear what he has to say. The title of his lecture is Brexit ... reversing 1,000 years of history between these islands. So come and get all the flavors of opinion at UEA. You can book that by visiting the link, which is going to be posted in the chat right now, and there will be a recording of tonight's event available for playback on YouTube at a later date, so you can revisit all your greatest hits. The link will be sent to you by email. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you for coming, and again, thank you very much to Dan Ham. It's been a pleasure and really interesting to talk to you this evening. Thank you and good night.